Hello, everyone. Welcome back to History 371 and hopefully some functional videos. So, this week we're dealing with South Africa, primarily in the 20th century. But before we do so, I thought it would be a good idea to do a little bit of review because the last time we dealt with South Africa was 3 or 4 weeks ago. So, what I want to do in this first video is just to review what was going on in South Africa up to about 1870, right? As a reminder of where we're going to end up here. Now, the major issue in Southern Africa really was white settlement, where we had whites, primarily whites of Dutch descent, who settled here from 1650 onward. That's going to make South Africa probably the most extreme case of a settler colony that we have on the continent. And, the fact is that there's going to be some comparable elements to other places. But, here it's going to be, well, it's frankly just going to be the worst. It's going to be the worst experience for Africans across the continent. And you'll see why in the next couple of videos. But it starts in 1652 then with the Dutch settling in Cape Town here, if you remember. Moving off into the interior, primarily at the expense of the Khoisan peoples, especially pastoralists around the Cape here. Initial expansion was pretty slow, about 25 miles in the first 50 years or so, settlement of some towns and things like that. But then it's going to take off and really expand exponentially. As we see the area around Cape Town, where we had expansion the first 50 years right around here. Well, by the next 50 years, the colony will be expanded all the way out to here, and the next 20 years all the way out to here. So you were going to have, the white settlers, once again, primarily of Dutch descent, who will later be known as the Boers. It's a Dutch word for farmer. And they're going to be carving off huge amounts of land. But they will, however, come to a stop out here along what's known as the Eastern Cape frontier as they bump up against settled farming peoples like the Xhosa and so on. And there, things are going to stay till about 1800 or so when the British are going to enter the scene. Now, what we see in the 19th century then, major themes that I introduced before, issues of group identity, both among African groups, of course, with the founding of the Ndebele, Zulu state, Lesotho, and the Griqua, and then also whites of Dutch descent becoming Boers and then Afrikaners, and frankly, I should include in that the whites of British descent as well. So we have a number of different groups changing how they identify themselves and coming into conflict on that basis. We're also going to see a number of population movements into, out of, and around the Cape Colony and the impact that will have on African states in particular. But really, overall, I guess it's really an issue of conflict over resources, right? As it always is. Land, labor, and livestock through the 19th century. As I said, though, one major change is going to be the British coming in and taking over the Cape Colony, having to do with Napoleonic Wars and sea routes and things like that. But the British taking over is going to introduce a number of changes into South Africa. I'll get to in just a minute. Well, actually, I'll get to them right now because that's the next one on the slide is one of these changes, which is abolition. Initially, the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, and then the abolition of slavery in 1838. And this will be a British proposition. There's no doubt about it. Then, as we also talked about before, in the interior, we have but related to the Cape, the Mfecane, often referred to as the crushing, but these population movements and conflicts over resources really is what it is. Then in the mid to late 1830s, Boer treks into the interior. So whites of Dutch descent, these Boers moving out of the Cape Colony further into the interior. also adding to the conflict of the Mfecane period, really. And then founding of African states like the Zulu state in 1816 and the Lesotho state in 1824 that we're going to read about in the Ndemakume article. And then the last one, Xhosa cattle killing, 1856-57, a millennial movement among the Xhosa-speaking peoples in response to expansion of colonial rule in their area. So once again, British rule coming in is going to bring a number of things which are going to change the nature, especially of the Cape Colony and Cape Society. The British being more liberal than the Boers were. We're also going to have the introduction of British law, abolition that I already mentioned, the linkage of the Cape Colony in particular into a British imperial economy, because by the 19th century then we're seeing a sort of resurge in Britain. Of course, they had just lost their North American colonies, darn them. But they still have possessions in the Caribbean, and of course are expanding their colonization in India. So they do have a global economy, and South Africa and the Cape Colony in particular is going to be linked into that. Another issue is going to be the introduction of Christian missionaries, something that when the Cape Colony was a Dutch settlement was not encouraged. We're going to see a boom in Christian missionaries in the 19th century. Well, in part because of British rule, in part just because it's a boom time for evangelical Christianity, actually. So those two are going to dovetail together and have an impact on South Africa here. Introduction of the British military is going to be a major point with the expansion of European settlement in the region. And then finally, an increase in immigration, primarily British immigration, is going to change the nature of the Cape Colony as well. All right. Now, the missionary expansion, and you can see on this map here, each one of these dots is a mission station settled in South Africa in the 19th century. And if you can read in the upper left there, just a list of mission societies, Anglican Church, American Church, and so on, all the way down the line there. Was it 5 different Lutheran groups, Roman Catholics, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, one group also that you don't see listed on there, they come a little bit later, was the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which actually was a U.S. Church, but is going to spread in South Africa. And I raise that in particular because that's going to be the church that Ndemakume is going to be a member of, who you'll read about in that life story of his. So, what we see as these, and you see actually in his life in general, these larger issues that are looming here, like introduction to missionaries, well, you see the impact that has on an individual like that. Okay. So we see the rise of states in the region then, once again, the Zulu under Shaka, and then his successors, Dingaan and Mpande, carrying pretty much through the 19th century there. The Ndwandwe, Mtetwa, Ndebele, and Lesotho that we'll talk about here too, because it also shows up in the Ndemakume reading. And a number of these leaders were very long-lived and very long in power. I mean, you see Mpande, 32 years. You see Mzilikazi there, 40 some odd years. Mosheshwe, almost 50 years. The Xhosa rulers, also many, many decades. So, it's actually a testament, I think, to them that they're able to withstand, everything, the Mfecane, the Boer Treks, the expansion of the British state, and everything in this region in the 19th century. And then finally, the other two states we're going to see founded in the 19th century here are these Boer republics in the interior of the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. All right, so What we reviewed before, talked about before, was the Mfecane, and we see at least one interpretation of it here. But the end result is going to be a lot of conflict and violence in the interior and population movements, mostly away from the Cape Colony. And the Ndebele in particular, starting out in around the Zulu area here, moving further up onto the High Veld, and then finally up into what becomes Zimbabwe today. So it is a time of a great deal of violence and consolidation of states. And one result of that is when these states do consolidate and form, I think more cohesive and frankly defensive positions, it leaves what had hitherto been, free and open rangeland unpopulated, and that's going to be, kind of a beacon for the Boers of the Cape Colony, who are going to want to leave there and move into the interior. One of the states, then, as I said, we see is the rise of the Sotho Kingdom under Moshoeshoe, founded around Thaba-Bosiu here, and then expanding out around it to encompass a good bit of territory, including these lowland areas here, which are going to be the primary farming land. Now, in conflict with that is going to be these Boer treks, and we read that trek leader statement before about moving off into the interior, and that was from 1837 and so on. But we're going to see, though, a large number of whites of Dutch descent becoming, frankly, disgruntled with British rule in the Cape Colony and what they feel are unfair restrictions on them. Especially with abolition and so on. So they want to move off in the interior and settle their own states, which they indeed do. The one right here bordering the Sotho state is the Orange Free State, and then the one up here across the Vaal River is the South African Republic, or also becomes known as the Transvaal, because it's trans or across the Vaal River, right? And of course, in doing so, they will come in contact and conflict with the Africans who live out there. And so it's actually, we talk about the Boer treks happening in the 1830s. It's going to be a matter of some 50 or 60 years of expansion of these states before they're able to take over and really control a lot of this land in the interior. Once again, somewhat comparable to the expansion of the U.S. Westward, right? As an incremental happening, really starting in the 18th century, if you consider Ohio the West, as it was at the time, but certainly through the 19th century across the Mississippi and into the western United States. It's a year by year, decade by decade sort of thing, and same thing here. It takes a period of time then. And as they do, they keep carving off more and more land. As we can see the example of Lesotho here, right? The original boundaries were all the way out here. And then with the Treaty of 1849, then, this section gets carved off here. That gets lost to the Boer settlers. And then the Convention of 1870, then this land over here gets carved off into the Boer settlers. So it's once again comparable to North America. You had these native groups holding these large states, and they get more and more land taken away until they end up on a reservation, literally a smaller amount of land reserved for them. Same sort of process we're going to see here, or we did see actually in Southern Africa. Here we just have a map showing kind of the Boer treks and where they move off into the interior and up into the Transvaal and, even into the Natal area here and so on. But extending further into the interior throughout the 19th century then. There's the Sotho Mountain Fortress, basically the heart of Lesotho. And then finally, we end up in with a Southern Africa in about 1870 that looks like this. A Cape colony here, ruled over by the British, a Natal colony, also British, and then these Boer republics in the interior, the Orange Free State and the South African Republic, or the Transvaal. Now, eventually, they will come to encompass all that territory up to the Limpopo here, but not yet. It's still going to be a process of expansion for another about 3 decades or so. All right, so that's where we were up to about 1870. Thank you.